The second pick will be made by the Memphis Grizzlies, and that means that the number one pick in the 2019 NBA draft goes to the New Orleans Pelicans.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Big Easy Sports Talk podcast. My name is Nick Garisco, and I'm here with Michael Pelichet. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, if you like what you hear today, please subscribe to this podcast and give us a great rating on iTunes. And you can follow us on all social media at Best Podcast NOLA. Let's tip off with the story of the week, maybe the year, and possibly even the decade, and that is the New Orleans Saints signing fullback Michael Burton. Just kidding. The New Orleans Pelicans won the NBA lottery last night and the right to select Zion Williamson, who is truly regarded as a generational talent and one of the most coveted NBA prospects in years. This is an absolute franchise changer. The Pelicans had a 6% chance of landing the top pick in this year's draft, and I went absolutely nuts when I saw the pick. I was jumping around. I was screaming. I looked like that little kid on YouTube who opened his Christmas present and freaked out when it was the Nintendo 64 and he's running around being like, Nintendo 64! Which I can totally relate to, but man, I totally lost it, Michael. And there's so many different storylines that we're going to discuss here today. We got to get to them all. But Michael, first, what was your initial reaction when we were awarded the number one overall pick and the opportunity to draft Zion Williamson?
It was a reaction that a 29-year-old should be embarrassed about, because I reacted honestly like you're saying, kind of like a little kid. I mean, I'm not really an excitable fan by any means, but this is a pretty big deal, and I was going nuts. My girlfriend and my roommate were sitting in here basically watching me behave like a child for at least a minute, maybe longer.
Yeah, it's hard to explain to other people what this really means, but we're going to do our best on this podcast. But Michael, it's not written in stone yet, but let's assume the Pelicans draft Zion Williamson with the first overall pick this summer. Let's talk about what he brings to the court and how does he help the Pelicans strictly from a basketball sense. And there's so many great qualities that he has, but really, let's kind of go over his strengths. What makes him so dominant as a basketball player?
A lot of things. I mean, he's the best NBA prospect in my mind since Anthony Davis. I think if you look at someone like Zion, he has an extremely high floor. Worst case scenario, he's going to wind up being a really good player. He's a great rebounder. He's a great impact defender, and he's an amazing efficient scorer. So like he puts up crazy points on crazy efficiency in a way that we haven't seen. And man, I don't even know if there is a comparison, honestly. He is an unreal athlete with unreal highlight level athleticism. He's someone who has a high motor, who seems to have all the intangibles that you'd want in a star. He's 6'6", 270 or 280 pounds, depending on who your source is, and a guy who moves like he's 6'6", 230, 240. It's unreal. He is just, I'm running out of words. He's an incredible prospect.
Yeah, you're getting me pumped up just kind of talking about him right now. And I'm not the talent evaluator that you are for basketball, of course, but I have been watching Zion, being a Duke fan, and we've actually gotten a lot of heat on this podcast from some of our regular listeners. They give me a hard time saying, hey, I know you're a Duke fan, but why do you talk about Zion Williamson so much on your local podcast? And we have, but it's,
one of us has.
Yeah, well, one of us has. But here we are. I mean, the reason we're talking about him so much is because, honestly, not because we predicted this to happen, of course, but because he is honestly a total freak of nature. I mean, this guy leaps out of the gym. He's got like an unreal combination of power and speed. And the word that I keep hearing and going back to describe him is just explosiveness. Like, explosiveness in his movements. He really defies logic with how he's making these jaw-dropping dunks with regularity, honestly. And he's also, like you said, he's versatile. He's a good passer. He got double teamed often at Duke, and he was able to make the right basketball play, good basketball IQ. He's unstoppable in transition. I mean, he's always making the right play there, and he's just so big and so strong, coming right at you. Really unstoppable in transition. And he also, this isn't about offense. I mean, we can talk about offensive efficiency all day, but this guy is a great defender too. He anticipates steals and blocks better than really anyone I've seen on the college level in a long time. But Michael, it's not all positives here. We want to be somewhat objective, right? We're obviously very excited, but we have to be somewhat objective here. What are some of his weaknesses?
I mean, I think the main thing, I really feel like there's really only one, and I think that's his shooting. So he shot 64% from free throw. He shot 33.8% from three. And it's important to note that a three-pointer in college is a couple feet shorter than the NBA. So that shot is really a deep mid-range shot in the NBA. So the shot is definitely, in today's NBA, because it is so important, it is something that he will have to fix. Luckily for us and for him, it's actually one of the most commonly fixed things in the NBA. So, but if you're looking at him objectively, then clearly he has some work to do on his shot. It's really hard in today's NBA to get away with not having a good shot, no matter how athletic you are. I think worst case scenario, he doesn't figure it out. I think he'll still be a very, very good NBA player. But again, it's hard to get away with that and become a true superstar. So I think that's what he has to work on.
How hard do you think it is to correct that kind of shot? I mean, I know he has the athleticism to do it, but not every player in the NBA, just because they're athletic, means they have a great shot, right?
Yeah, and it's funny too. I actually was looking at this today, but so the top 20 scorers in today's NBA in terms of a point per game basis and from last year during the regular season, or I should say this year, only two of them shot below 70% from the free throw line. One of them was LeBron James. One of them was Russell Westbrook. And the reason that I go to free throw percentage is that there isn't a lot of data on 3-point shots. So one, like the line is different in college, and then also you just don't have a lot of attempts. So free throw shooting has been shown to correlate more with how an NBA player is going, or how an NCAA player is going to translate his shooting to the next level. So that's what I'm looking for. Is I'm looking for guys who can hit shots at a consistent level at the line. And so Zion's at 64. Right. Yeah, I mean, yeah. And so you're talking about there are a lot of people who wind up figuring it out, but there are also people who don't. So I mean, it could be either way for Zion. But that someone like Westbrook who never figured out his shot, you're seeing what happens when teams defend him the way that they do now, and he takes a lot of bad shots. It affects the way that he can get to the rim. His efficiency is very poor. This is something that I think it matters, and and he has otherworldly athleticism, as does LeBron. And even LeBron took some time to adjust to defenses playing off of him in the playoffs. So I think that you have to consider that when you're looking at Zion as well.
Where do you think his ideal position is, kind of his mainstay spot is, whether it's small forward, power forward, or even center? I think he's got the versatility to even play all three at certain points of the game. But where do you think he ultimately ends up?
I think you're right to point to the versatility. And because in today's NBA, you're often switching, especially if you're someone who can switch between positions. It's a commonly used tactic. I think if you had to peg him for position right now, I think it would be a small ball four. And it's even weird for me to call him a small ball four because at this point, because of the way the NBA is trending, that's actually a fairly commonplace thing. I think you would start him at the four for now. Someone who's actually an incredible talent evaluator is Mike Schmitz over at formerly Draft Express, but now it's owned by ESPN. He's someone who said that he could see Zion winding up being a small ball five. I think that's a fairly reasonable expectation because he's so strong. And a lot of the things that people worry about with lack of height at bigger positions is someone's going to score in the post on them or whatever. One, the league is kind of moving away from a lot of big men post scorers and traditional bigs. And two, Zion is so strong at 270 or 280 that he has a lower body strength to push someone out further away from the goal. And a lot of being a really good post scorer is being closer to the goal. So if you can push them away from that and also be an excellent perimeter defender, I mean, you're talking about someone who is going to be a real defensive asset for your team.
Michael, what NBA players right now Zion Williamson compare to kind of give an audience a feel of kind of what to expect on the court? Let's kind of give a floor and ceiling kind of comparison for Zion Williamson.
I think his floor is probably Blake Griffin. We can talk about statistically what he is. I'll probably get into that more in a second. But in terms of style, I think he probably most closely compares with Griffin. Griffin was seen as a somewhat undersized power forward with just jaw-dropping athleticism. I think Zion, he's probably the last prospect that I thought was anywhere close to what Zion is athletically, but he was also probably 240 or 250 coming out, not 270 or 280. I think if you're looking at the statistical profile in terms of what caliber he is, I think he is, again, the best prospect since Davis, and he actually compares really favorably with both Davis and Kevin Durant from their freshman years. I mean, and this is just going to give you an example. I mean, Zion is seen as someone who obviously is a very good scorer, but I don't think people realize how good of a scorer he was last year. So Zion, on a per 40-minute basis, actually scored 30 points a game last year, which is incredibly high. So Durant was 28.8. So he's scoring basically about the same frequency as Durant. And he's also doing it at 68% field goal percentage, which is insane. Durant was 47.3. And again, this is not to say that Zion Williamson is going to be a better NBA scorer than Kevin Durant or anything like that. But this is to say that someone who is an incredible scorer in the NBA and who was incredible as a freshman actually doesn't even stack up to someone like Zion Williamson in terms of what his statistics were saying. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, you compared him to Anthony Davis and Kevin Durant. Zion Williamson, according to Jeff Duncan, was the third freshman ever to record 500 points, 500 steals, and 500 blocks in a season. And the only two players who did it before him in the history of basketball are Anthony Davis and Kevin Durant. So yeah, I'm kind of, maybe he won't end up being the scorer that Kevin Durant is, but that really is kind of who he compares to on the statistical level.
Yeah, that, and then also, so I haven't even mentioned the fact that he's pretty much on the same level rebounding as Durant, a shade below Davis, a better passer than either one of those in terms of statistics, right? So, but also, I think you had said something about this earlier. So Zion registered 2.8 steals and 2.4 blocks per 40 minutes in college, which is insane. I keep using these words. I don't want people to think I'm exaggerating. This is truly one of the most amazing statistical packages that I have ever seen.
Right.
If not the most amazing. It's unreal.
He really has amazing anticipation and timing on his steals and blocks. He recognizes plays really well. He can get in passing lanes and he goes for a lot of steals, don't get me wrong, and sometimes he'll whiff, but he has the wherewithal and just great anticipation, and obviously the movement and the quickness is there for somebody his size. It's really remarkable. And obviously his blocks, we've seen some of them on SportsCenter Top 10, of course, where he will be so far away from somebody when they initially pull up. And the range the ground that he covers and the height that he covers on his jumps will always catch shooters so off guard that it's kind of comical when you're seeing these slow-mo replays of it, how high he can get off the ground. It's really very Space Jam-esque, I gotta say. So, and the best part about all this, Michael, we haven't even talked about his personality, honestly. Yeah. I know that's kind of the boring thing to talk about, but this isn't some guy who's, so overhyped and, had these LeBron-like expectations going into Duke, and, he's exceeded him and he thinks he's all that. No, this is quite the opposite. This guy has a radiant personality. He's extremely humble, and by pretty much everybody's account, this guy is a great kid off the court. And I respect the most, or maybe not the most, but I definitely respect that he's got great conditioning for his size. So even though you could argue that, this guy's really heavy, conditioning rarely ever seems like an issue to him. And he also plays with a ton of emotion, which I really like to see. So, I mean, even from a personality standpoint, this guy really is the complete package as a basketball player. So we talked about him as a basketball player, but now I want to get your impression of what he does off the court. Let's talk about the impact that he brings to the New Orleans Pelicans and how he kind of changes the franchise there. Michael, how does he alter the perception of the New Orleans Pelicans now that Zion Williamson is very likely going to be a Pelican?
I'm going to answer that, and I want to use what you had just said about his personality to kind of illustrate that, because I think, like you're saying, personality, he could be a great guy and be terrible at basketball. So obviously you need both. But so I think that you at least need him to be very good at basketball. But I think him being a great person makes him much more likely, and he seems like to be a hardworking guy. He's much more likely to reach his ceiling because of the person that he is with his motor, the way he works. And then about what you're asking about directly, I think he totally changes the franchise culture here. I think that this area, I mean, New Orleans is not a basketball city, and you probably know more about this than anybody because you're a football guy. But I think that we haven't really had something to be excited about. So besides Davis getting drafted, but even then I wouldn't say he's the most entertaining player. He's certainly a great player. He might wind up being a better player than Zion ever is. But in terms of someone who really reinvigorates the culture, I don't think he's that guy. And I think Zion is. So I think this is something that we desperately need. I think, especially with Tom Benson's passing, I think, we're looking for where the future of this team is. And I think getting someone like Zion here who really changes the culture, who's an electrifying player, I think it's just really timely.
Right. And his style of play is so explosive that, I mean, it puts people in the seats. I mean, that's just how it is. I mean, you got to see, I'm sure you've seen it, but if you're listening right now, there's a video of the ticket office for the New Orleans Pelicans as they were watching the lottery. There's probably about 40 people in the room, and it is a total must see. It's one of the best videos. It's one of those videos that kind of gives you chills when you're watching it. And even if you're not a Pelicans fan, and if you're a Pelicans fan, it just kind of makes you want to cry a little. Tears of joy, of course. We retweeted this on our Twitter at Best Podcast NOLA. Go check it out. And Michael, Pelicans fans, since Zion Williamson was drafted, the Pelicans have sold 2,500 season tickets overnight, and as of 9 a.m. this morning. That's 2,500 tickets in a span of, let's say, 14 hours since Zion Williamson was drafted. Hey, that's incredible. This guy's going to do jersey sales, TV ratings. The entire perception of the Pelicans organization has totally changed. And, all these fans are coming out of the woodwork being like, oh, yeah, I was a Pelicans fan the whole time. And that's kind of, it can be aggravating as like an actual fan of the Pelicans when you see these casual fans coming out of nowhere claiming their allegiance here. But that's the sign of, that bandwagon effect is the sign of a team on the rise, right? Like that should be exciting, not annoying. And just to put it in a little bit of perspective, Zion Williamson has 3.2 million followers on Instagram at age 18. That's 18 years old, 3.2 million followers on Instagram. So, I mean, this is a pretty big deal from a PR perspective and, from a cultural perspective. And boy, did we need it, Michael. I mean, the Minneapolis Miracle, the NOLA no call, the two way that the Saints have, tragically been, outed in the playoffs. And then we had the Anthony Davis debacle. And that whole saga there with him wanting to leave. And then LSU just annually has to deal with Nick Saban in the SEC. So Louisiana sports fans definitely needed this. So it was just really exciting, man.
Yeah, no, I think this is the most excited I've been so since actually AD got drafted by us, or since I figured out that we had the first pick to get AD. And it's just crazy that we've had two of the best prospects in recent memory. It's a great time to be a Pelicans fan.
So speaking of AD, I'm interested in. There's a lot of talk going on right now, right? Like there's a lot of talk that Anthony Davis, maybe he might want to come back and be a New Orleans Pelican now. Not that he's left yet officially, But, he's made his intentions clear of wanting to be traded. And his agent even said last night after the New Orleans Pelicans landed the number 1 overall pick that Anthony Davis's intentions of being traded remain the same, despite New Orleans getting the number 1 overall pick. And we've heard new GM David Griffin say multiple times that he wants Anthony Davis back. So what are your thoughts on Anthony Davis potentially staying now that New Orleans is in a position to get Zion Williamson? Do you think it affects it? And I also want to know, what side are you on? Do you want him to stay, or would you rather trade Anthony Davis?
I'd say it certainly affects our flexibility as a franchise moving forward. I think you have to look at this somewhat objectively and say that Zion probably won't be a player capable of being on a championship team for at least a couple of years. That's fairly commonplace for any NBA first-year player. I think, especially if you have a skill set that, if you don't have a great shot right away, Zion is really polished in a lot of ways, but I wouldn't say that he's going to be able to shoot right away, and I think that'll impact his ability to be on a championship team. So ultimately, I think that Davis will still wind up getting shipped, and that's exactly what I want. I don't think it should affect his judgment of the Pelicans because he is Zion so young. So that's exactly what I'd expect. I even though, there's a small part of me that says maybe we can make a pitch to keep Davis, and I just feel like it's time to go for AD.
Yeah, the writing seems like it's been on the wall, and I'm against retaining AD as well. My question is, why would we want to keep a player who doesn't want to be here? Period. Yeah. It's actually a question, but that's the end of the discussion for me. If he doesn't want to be with the New Orleans Pelicans, with this organization, after we landed the number 1 overall pick, after things are looking up with new GM David Griffin, and after we hired the best trainer in the NBA, Aaron Nelson, if he doesn't want to be with us here, despite having Drew Holiday and all these other positive things that are going for the New Orleans Pelicans, if he still doesn't want to be here after everything we dealt with last season, I don't want him here. I don't want to play, and it's not anything against Anthony Davis personally, but I just don't want any player here if they don't want to be here. It's really, that might be a very simplistic way of looking at things, but that's the way I'm looking at this. To be honest, if a player doesn't want to be here, I don't want him here. So I'm hoping that we do trade him.
Yeah, I think it depends. So I would caveat what you said with one thing. If he doesn't want to be here and his contract is ending soon, because to me, it's different from trying to convince someone who has 4 or 5 more years on his contract, who is going to have to stick around because of his contractual obligation, than trying to convince someone who could bolt as early as not this summer coming up, but the next summer. And I think I stand exactly where you do. I don't want someone in this situation who could easily bolt, and then he's a franchise talent, so you can get something for him right now. Why would you keep him and take the chance that he'll just walk in a year when that seems to be the most likely scenario?
Yeah, and this isn't a situation where, normally when guys are about to be shipped or traded, normally what you're saying is right. You can get something for them, so you might as well do it. But this is not the situation, right, Michael, where we're only getting something for him. We could potentially get a lot for Anthony Davis, and I kind of want to go over the possibilities there on this podcast here. I think the best way to do this is to just kind of narrow down the 3 teams that are most likely to trade for Anthony Davis, and I kind of want to hear your thoughts on each of their I wouldn't say the best possible package they could offer for Anthony Davis, but I would say the most realistic one that you would be a fan of, like keeping expectations reasonable here. Let's start with the Boston Celtics, okay? And the Boston Celtics were one of the first teams that were rumored to be interested in Anthony Davis when he wanted to be put on the trade block. Do you still want Jason Tatum there, or do they need to offer more than that? What do you kind of see as the Celtics making a pitch for Anthony Davis?
I think it all depends on whether or not Kyrie walks, but let's just pretend for a second that Kyrie is going to want to stay in Boston. I think they would absolutely be interested in AD, and I think they would give us the best offer. I think the offer would probably be centered around Jason Tatum Marcus Smart, and then just some picks, some first round picks, whether it's this year or the ones they have in the future from Memphis. I think that would probably be the structure of the trade. And that's the base of it. Again, you can talk about trade filler and all that. Usually it centers around a few pieces. I think if I'm looking at this objectively, I think Tatum is a really, really good fit next to Zion. And I think he would probably be, of all the different things that we're going to talk about, I think he is the asset that I would chase the most, because I think he pairs so well with Zion.
And he's very young. I think he's 20 years old.
Yeah.
But why do you think that he pairs so well with Zion? What are some of the things that Jason Tatum brings to the table?
I think the main thing, so one, it's always in today's NBA, it's really, like you said earlier, it's somewhat positionless. I think that having wings, it's really, really easy to plug and play. You can really put a lot of wings in one lineup, so you don't have to worry about siloed positions like they used to have. Tatum gives us exactly that. And I think also from a skill set perspective, he really, really matches well with Zion. So Tatum is a really good isolation scorer. He's someone who's already a really great shooter, which is very rare for a guy this young, especially at that size. And I think ultimately he's the kind of guy that I would want taking a shot at the end of a game. I don't think he's afraid of the moment. I think he would thrive in a more high usage role than he has in Boston right now. And I don't know, and this is not a knock against Zion, nor is this a declaration, I don't know if Zion will ever be a last shot kind of guy. I don't overvalue that. So I do think that someone like Zion, I still prefer him to Tatum and prefer him to a lot of players. But I do want at least one player on a roster who can take the final shot. And I really want a guy who's about 6'7", 6'8", because it's a lot easier for that kind of guy to get his shot off than any other kind of player.
Right. And you don't want to overemphasize the idea where, you know, the clutch gene and all the stuff when you see on the ESPN and all the media hype about, you know, who's most clutch player under pressure and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, you don't want to overemphasize it, but at the end of the day, every championship team, and that is the goal, to win a championship, every championship team does need a player at least that you can kind of go to in these key moments. I mean, there's 82 games in a season, and that's not even counting playoffs. And a lot of them are, whether, you know, it's a clutch moment with 2 minutes left to play or a clutch moment with 2 seconds left to play, a lot of them, you know, come down to an inbounds play where you have a certain amount of time and you need a big shot. And if Zion isn't the type of shooter yet who can handle that, then it would make sense to complement him with a shooter.
Yeah, and I also think, I mean, ultimately, I think that, again, the flexibility is really huge. And I think it's also, this is sort of a weirder point to be making, but because the NBA game is moving so much towards shots at the rim and only threes, or those two together, and not a lot of mid-range work, some people don't love the fact that it's not aesthetically pleasing as it used to be. Popovich has been one that's spoken up against that. I wouldn't be shocked at some point if the NBA moved the three-point line back a little bit to make it slightly less efficient. And I think if that happened, mid-range people would get a really big boost. Tatum is exactly that. So Tatum is a guy who can post up in the mid-post. He's a guy who has really, really good footwork for a young age. He can score from any level of the floor. I think he's someone that, in projecting forward, is going to be really, really good. And in a league that prioritizes skill over athleticism at this point to some extent, you obviously need to have enough athleticism to get by and hopefully a little bit more. But you find a lot of players today who are highly athletic but don't have skill and can't survive. And Tatum is both very, very skilled and very athletic. So I think he's someone who would go really, really far in the way the NBA is trending.
And he's also another Duke Blue Devil, which we can't seem to stop talking about them here. So I would be all for that, of course. But the Celtics do have 3 first-round picks this year, right? I think they're in the teens and 20s, though. They're late first. But they could also throw those into the trade. And I hear Marcus Smart is being mentioned a lot. What do you think about the package around Tatum if Boston were to get a deal done?
I think it's excellent. So, I mean, I think that one of the biggest things they have is they're going to have the Memphis pick for next year. Now, it was top 8 protected this year, so it didn't convey to them. It's top 6 protected next year, and then unprotected in 2021. So that's the pick they have from Memphis. And then they actually have a first rounder as well from this year, in addition to their own. So I think it's something to where you probably would wind up getting 1 pick this year and maybe one pick, the Memphis pick for the future, whether that's 2020 or 2021. And then I think as far as Smart goes, I mean, Smart's one of the guys that I tend to overvalue guys who do the dirty work. I really, really like those types of players. Marcus Smart is an awesome guy like that. So Marcus Smart, not a great shooter, certainly has his issues on offense. But if you're looking for a guy who is an excellent, excellent perimeter defender and also someone who will make a lot of plays within the game, small plays, whether it's taking a charge or whether it's just hustling for a loose ball, Marcus Smart is really, really good at that. And if he came over here and Drew was still here, I think we would easily have the best perimeter defense in the league.
Right.
It would be
Drew
great.
Holiday
It's a good package.
Because he's such a dominant defender, and Marcus Smart's one of the best defenders in the league as well. And, I said earlier that every championship team needs kind of a go-to guy late in games who can hit big shots. But every championship team also needs that scrappy, questionably dirty defensive player who kind of, goes all out and kind of annoys other teams. Not necessarily to like the Lance Stevenson level, but it just seems like every championship team has that type of Draymond Green or that type of Patrick Beverley, those type of guys who can get in other players, star players' heads and do all the dirty work, the ancillary stuff that really they don't show up on the stat sheet, but they really help put your team in position to win. So
and I do want to make one correction to what I said too. I want to add they actually have another pick that I forgot about. It just came to memory, but you're right. They have 3 first-round picks this year, so they have a lot of things they can give us.
Right. So let's move on to the next team, and this is the other team that was really in the initial sweepstakes when Anthony Davis was rumored to want out of New Orleans, and that was the Los Angeles Lakers. They did get into the lottery, Michael. They got the number 4 overall pick when I believe they were projected with the number 11 overall pick. So they made it to the lottery, but they ended up with the 4th pick. And so that gives them an extra asset, of course, because one of the main hiccups with not doing the trade with Los Angeles was that, they have Lonzo Ball, they have Brandon Ingram, they have Kyle Kuzma, all pretty solid players right now, and they have pretty good upside, but it's not enough for AD, right? Like even the 3 of them are not enough for AD. Now this 4th pick kind of makes it a little interesting. What's your take on the Lakers' chances of landing Anthony Davis in a trade?
I think they were the ones who lucked out the most outside of us for the lot. And we can talk about Memphis, but in terms of the Anthony Davis stuff, so Los Angeles, I didn't think had what they needed for a trade, and we had spoken about that before the deadline. I didn't think they'd get a deal done, and now all of a sudden they jump up from 11 to 4 and get a really good pick to be packaging in any sort of deal, whether it's for Davis or for someone else. I would be shocked if that pick wasn't conveyed for someone else, whether it's Davis or someone else. I think ultimately, like you said, I really struggle with there are a lot of good prospects. I like Lonzo a lot. I think that Ingram's a good player, and I like Kuzma as well. It's hard to develop, though, so many prospects at one time, and that's where it just, for me, it's quality over quantity, and that's why I want someone like Tatum, who I think is a much more surefire prospect than any of the guys the Lakers are offering, maybe even including that 4th pick. And we're also getting multiple picks from the Celtics anyway, so it's not as good for me. It's it's not something that I'm going to go cry about if we get the Lakers trade and we wind up with several high caliber prospects and then a really good draft pick, but it wouldn't be my ideal scenario.
Yeah, the Lakers, I just don't know if that 4th pick is going to be enough to move the needle, especially in a draft where, Zion's projected to go number 1. Ja Morant is projected to go number 2 to Memphis. And then the 3rd overall pick is, right now at least, things are subject to change, of course, but right now it looks like RJ Barrett is going to go number 3. And we'll talk about him with the Knicks in a second because they do have the 3rd pick in this draft. But it seems like there's kind of a talent drop-off after pick 3. And a lot of the analysts on ESPN were saying the same last night during the NBA lottery, which makes me think that in that type of venue, which makes me think that they've been talking to some of these teams. So it's at least pretty credible to me to go ahead and have that opinion. And also just because even if RJ Barrett goes number 3, there are a lot of reasons why Zion Williamson might want to pair up with his former teammate. Again, we can get all that in a second, but I just don't know if the 4th pick is going to be good enough with all of those, good but not great players for the Los Angeles Lakers. So we'll see. But let's move on to New York for now. And that's the New York Knicks, who a lot of their fans were devastated that they did not get the number 1 overall pick and the chance to land Zion Williamson. And they had a 14% chance to do so, which was tied with the highest probability. But they ended up with the 3rd overall pick, which is pretty good. And it's that, as I'm trying to say, I think it's fairly a lot more valuable than the 4th overall pick. So now the Knicks have the 3rd overall pick, and they also have a couple of young players who could develop into something. What do you see the New York Knicks offering for Anthony Davis in a potential deal there?
This isn't something that I've said before, and I probably should have said it, but I think the Zion thing gives the Pelicans a lot of leverage because we're not all of a sudden rushed to trade Davis the way that we would have been before, because now we kind of have a lot of different avenues we can take. I think that so the Knicks have a few things. So they have that 3rd pick, like you've mentioned. They also have Kevin Knox, Mitchell Robinson. They have Dennis Smith Jr. I think, the combination of all those things is a pretty good haul. I really struggle to sort of evaluate how important it is to have a college teammate with Zion. I think at some level, they were college roommates. They were really good friends. They obviously worked really well on the court together. I don't know if that's worth being anything but a tiebreaker. So if I'm looking at this as the Knicks versus the Celtics, for instance, if I think that Tatum is a much better prospect than RJ Barrett, which I do, would I rather have Tatum and all that other stuff or RJ and all that other stuff and the fact that he's a roommate? So I don't see it on par with the Celtics package, but all else aside, if the Celtics package isn't there because Kyrie doesn't want to be with Boston and all of a sudden Boston withdraws its interest, I wouldn't be unhappy with RJ Barrett in that haul. I think that would be a pretty good land.
Right. And what do you think about Kevin Knox, Mitchell Robinson, and Dennis Smith Jr., the other players who've been kind of thrown around as younger guys who could be developed by the Pelicans in the event of an Anthony Davis trade? Kind of give me a brief scouting report on each of them.
Yeah, so Kevin Knox is a little bit raw, but he's also a 6'9" guy who can probably at some level or at some point create his own shot, score. Again, it's never bad to have a wing in today's NBA. I think that could be a really valuable player. Mitchell Robinson, maybe you could think of turning into a poor man's Rudy Gobert. I like that. I think there's some limit to that because big men are getting chased out of the playoffs because they can't defend the perimeter some of the time. You could talk about Dennis Smith Jr. and his ability to really be explosive and to get to the rim, but another guy who I have a really hard time getting sold on any 6'2", 6'3" guard who's not just an incredible scorer. I mean, like not Steph Curry level, but just really, really good. Like Damian Lillard is probably the perfect example. And so Dennis Smith is a guy who, if he doesn't wind up being a great distributor, which I don't think he will, he's not a great point guard, so to speak. And he's also not someone who is an elite enough of a scorer to where I really want him on my offense enough to live with the defensive issues. And the defensive issues to me is that it's really hard to get away with smaller guards because if you have guys who can't switch to other positions, you have a lot of things that can happen to you in an NBA offense where you won't be able to adjust. Now, you live with that if they're good enough point guards or they're good enough scorers to compensate for that. But I don't know if Dennis Smith will ever be that. We'll see.
Yeah, I think the New York Knicks, if we do that trade and we get RJ Barrett, who, like you said, was Zion Williamson's roommate and best friend at Duke, and we get Mitchell Robinson, the big center who blocks a lot of shots. We get Kevin Knox, who I think was the 7th overall pick in last year's draft, who's kind of developmental prospect there. And we get Dennis Smith Jr., who's also very young. I think it's basically getting 4 developmental guys. I think that's a little harsh, but you see what I'm trying to say, right? It's 4 guys who have not reached anywhere close to their peak, and we actually don't really
Correct.
know where their peak is. Whether, sure, the upside is really high for a guy like Kevin Knox and Mitchell Robinson and RJ Barrett, but they're not really close to where, a lot of projectors are thinking that they're going to pan out to be yet, and they might not ever get there because, like you said, it's tough to develop all those players. So the drawback of the Knicks trade seems to be that we're not getting a proven commodity or a veteran like Jason Tatum.
No, I think you nailed it. I think that's exactly it. I mean, so you can talk about potential all day, but I mean, look, it's hard to develop into an NBA star or anything resembling it. So I mean, you even with 4 people, that's not like your odds are multiplied by 4. You're talking about, like we've talked about, there's only one ball. You can't, so whatever shot that someone's taking, someone else isn't, right? So you can look no further than someone like Tatum today, to where Tatum is, he's not phased out of the offense or anything like that, but I think that Tatum is capable of much more than he's doing. But because they have so many offensive options with Boston, he's not necessarily getting the volume scoring that he probably is capable of. So I think that is perfect for New York, where you have all these young guys. How are you going to develop all of them? Only one of them can have the ball, and you already have Zion. So you keep Drew. Drew gets the ball some. I mean, you're talking about one ball and a lot of mouths to feed.
Right, and that doesn't give us the New York Knicks package, even though all those players could develop to be good players, and even if they do, it doesn't give us that closeout scorer like we wanted, like we said we were getting with Jason Tatum. So it is pretty interesting here, and I get the impression, Michael, that you're leaning towards the Jason Tatum trade with Boston as your favorite because of the provenness of the deal and getting kind of a guy that is going to be a top 25 player in the NBA, and he might already be. But I'm curious about. I just want to say this first. It's so interesting that a lot of this really depends on how the superstars in this league flow this offseason. You know what I'm trying to say?
Oh, yeah. No doubt.
Boston, if Kyrie Irving, who's on Boston right now, I think he's actually going to leave Boston, but it's not a sure thing, of course. But if he goes to New York, I think it gives New York even more incentive to want a player like Anthony Davis and not try to develop a pick 3 like RJ Barrett, because New York's probably desperate for a star either way. But if they get Kyrie Irving and or Kevin Durant, I mean, they're really going to want to go after Anthony Davis to solidify this thing. And Boston's kind of the same way. Like, what happens if Kyrie Irving leaves and then all of a sudden their best player is Jason Tatum, and he's now their top asset, and they don't really want to trade him anymore. And especially when it's just going to be one potential star for a star like AD, I think they would still be interested in AD, of course, but maybe not as interested, because it kind of affects if the team's going to win now or later. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you can look even, you talked about Kyrie, which I think is definitely important. That's going to affect things. I think you could look at Kevin Durant. I mean, so Golden State's run the table for a few years now. So what happens if Kevin Durant leaves, and it doesn't matter where he goes, all of a sudden the floodgates are open, and now not only is Durant going somewhere else, but then all of a sudden the competitive balance has shifted. Maybe Golden State isn't unstoppable now.
Yeah.
That changes everything. Now the Rockets have less incentive to blow it up at some point if they, it's just, there's so many ramifications, and I think this is the perfect time to talk about how anytime anybody tells you of a certainty in the NBA, you can be most certain that they're not being completely honest, because there's just so many different avenues and so many different permutations of these things that there's so many scenarios and things are affected, like, I just snapped physically as if people can hear that. But you can look at Paul George. Everybody said he's going to LA for sure after Oklahoma City traded for him. And look what happened. I mean, it didn't pan out, but Paul George stayed there. These are human beings. And this is a complex ecosystem of so many different things in the NBA that it's so hard to predict.
Right. There's a lot of variables. We've even heard that LeBron James is being in trade rumors lately. So I don't know how much I buy into that. But, I mean, Kawhi Leonard, LeBron James, I've heard Jimmy Butler's name a lot. I've heard Klay Thompson's name a lot. Boogie Cousins, that's a familiar name in New Orleans. These are all names that I've heard are either going to be free agents or, looking for some kind of trade. So there's a lot of pieces of the puzzle to happen here or to be put together here, and it kind of really impacts what team is most likely to target Anthony Davis in a trade.
Yeah, I agree. It's going to be fun to watch it all play out.
I'm curious about any other teams that might be in the running, that kind of dark horses for this situation right now. I've heard Chicago a lot. What's something that Chicago could put together?
I think Chicago kind of got screwed by the lottery. So I think if Chicago had gotten a high pick, you could have convinced me that Lauri Markkanen and Zach LaVine and a pick would have been a pretty good haul. I think the fact that their pick dropped so much kind of puts them out of it. So I think Chicago is pretty out of it at this point. And I think also that the Clippers are another team that are certainly looking to make a splash. I think you could convince me that they would flip some of their assets for more attractive things that the Pelicans would want. And maybe then they would have a very, very, very far outside chance of getting Davis. But I think these three teams that we've talked about, the Knicks, Celtics, and the Lakers, of course, are the three teams that have the most likely scenarios of getting Davis.
So if you have to sum it up and you have to pick really quickly, I'm going to put you on the spot here.
Okay.
I'm going to get you to make a prediction. Where do you think Anthony Davis is most likely playing next year? Is it on the Pelicans or which of the three teams that we've already mentioned?
Man, this is really hard. If I had to get, let me get percentages. So I think Boston is still the most likely scenario, but I think that's entirely contingent upon whether Kyrie wants to leave. So I think if Kyrie stays, I think it's pretty much 100% chance, or as close to it, that Davis would wind up going there. If Kyrie walks, if Kyrie walks, on the other hand, I think it's really unlikely that the Celtics would want to go after Davis. I mean, I don't think it's entirely implausible, but I do think it's more likely than not that they would not necessarily want to exchange it all for Davis, knowing that he could just walk in a year. So let's say 40% for Boston. And I kind of want to split it evenly between LA and New York. I think it depends on your talent evaluation of RJ Barrett. I'm not entirely certain that RJ Barrett's scoring is going to be as good as his points per game would indicate. I think he really took some poor shots. I'm a little bit worried about the fact that he's a volume scorer with a poor shot at this juncture. So I think it depends upon that. But I think New York and LA are close enough to where you could swing 30, you can swing 5 points off of that either way. So I'll say 40 Celtics, 30 New York, 30 Los Angeles.
All right. That's a pretty good summary right there. I kind of share a lot of your sentiments. My gut is saying Boston, but my brain is or my head, if you will, is saying the New York Knicks are going to be the team that is most likely to get this deal done. And let's kind of continue talking about the Knicks real quickly because we mentioned a couple of times RJ Barrett played at Duke with Zion Williamson, and they were roommates. They were best friends. And the reason I want to bring this up is because it seems a little more important after this interview that we saw Zion Williamson give right after it was announced that the Pelicans have the first pick. And I know that, they put him on the spot. And I know it's a lot of emotions. He's just a kid, and it totally shocked him that the Pelicans won the lottery. But I don't know. Let's just have y'all take a listen. I want to get your thoughts, Michael.
Man, as we said earlier tonight, the match is getting lit tonight, and the ripple effect is going to be crazy. Maria Taylor is with Zion Williamson right now.
All right, Zion, all eyes were on you several times. You looked a little nervous while you were sitting down. How do you feel right now?
Still nervous. I don't know why. I'm just still nervous. Maybe because, like you said, all eyes were on me. And I think it's a lot to take in because I don't know where I'm going to be.
Well, when you saw New Orleans got the number one pick, you didn't think for a second, I could be in New Orleans?
It's definitely a possibility, but, I mean, it's not sure until it actually happens.
Have you ever been before?
I've never been.
Michael, what do you make of those responses to the questions?
Well, it's underwhelming. Ideally, I would like Zion to be more excited about going to the Pelicans, but ultimately, I have to look at this and say that if I were a player, New Orleans wouldn't be my number one in terms of destinations. I love you, New Orleans, but there are a lot of other places where you can get a bigger market, especially if you're doing shoe deals and stuff like that. I think that it's reasonable to expect that he wouldn't be super excited about not going to a big market and going to the Pelicans. Ultimately, I don't think it really matters. I think because of the way the NBA is structured, you really have control over those top players for multiple years. Anywhere from 7 to 9 years. So I think it's something to where I'm not really worried because of that. I think he'll wind up being just fine. He looks like someone who has very, very high character, someone I'd love to put in any locker room that I of a team that I follow. So I think it'll all work itself out in the end. What about you?
I was uncomfortable watching it. It definitely was a little bit of a buzzkill after I got all fired up. I got the impression that he really wanted to go to New York and be a New York Knick, but he's obviously not going to say that outright. He looks stunned, though, in a negative way. I hope once he visits and comes down here, he'll change his mind. New Orleans is obviously a very passionate place about its sports. I know it's a small market for basketball fans, but that's partly because the team hasn't really been winning, which I don't think helps the argument here. But ultimately, I don't think he's going to pull an Eli Manning and refuse to play for New Orleans like Eli did with San Diego. But it's at least worth mentioning that Zion Williamson can withdraw from the draft and go back to Duke for a year if he refuses to play for the Pelicans for any reason. I think it's unlikely that he does that because, like you said, he seems like a high-character guy. But I won't lie, the interview definitely left me with a sour taste in my mouth after my celebration. Now, I don't think he's going to pull an Eli Manning and demand to be in New York and refuse to play in New Orleans like Eli did with San Diego Chargers back in the day. I don't think he's that type of person like you were suggesting. However, it does kind of give me a little bit, of a pause. And that's why I think the notion of potentially adding RJ Barrett and trading that number 3 pick with the New York Knicks, it does give me, you used the good word the other moment when you said that it's a nice tiebreaker. I think it's a worthy tiebreaker, actually. I think if you're on the fence with two teams and you can make your superstar happy with bringing in his college roommate or his best friend here and kind of make the transition to New Orleans, a place where, he didn't really expect to go and he didn't really look that excited to go to. I think if you can ease that transition and make him a little happier, if you're tied on the deals, I think that's a worthy tiebreaker of satisfying your superstar. We all know from via Anthony Davis what a disgruntled superstar can look like to a franchise. So.
Yeah, well, I'm with you in that it's not super exciting for a player to give that kind of response, but I think it's all going to work out, and I think it's going to wind up being an awesome thing for the Pelicans. So it's a great time to be a Pels fan.
Oh yeah, this guy. We just you really can't put into words like how much this really means to the franchise of the New Orleans Pelicans. It's a total franchise changer, and Zion Williamson he just seems destined to be a superstar in this league for a long time. And hey, it may happen sooner than we think. That's going to wrap it up for this week's local episode. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure you become one of our best friends by subscribing to this podcast and giving us a great rating on iTunes. You can also follow us on all social media outlets at Best Podcast NOLA. We'll be back next week. Tell all your friends, hoot at, and flock up.